It's the 30th of March 2021 in Sweden at the 60th parallel, and I want to tell a little something about one of the less talked about benefits of holistically planned grazing, especially in really cold climates, which this here should be. And in a normal year there would still be about a meter of snow on the ground, so it would look very different. But even then the sheep should be able to graze, and I say should be because I don't have that experience yet. I've only had these ladies since last May, so this is the first winter we went through together. But holistically planned grazing in a tiny nutshell is moving around your grazing animals on paddocks, having them have a heavy impact on the grass there and other vegetation for a maximum of roughly up to 3 days in the growing season. Outside the growing season it can be longer because there's far less risk, if any, of overgrazing plants. And then after they've had their heavy impact, so a lot of the plants are eaten or trampled into the ground, and there is a lot of manure and urine and physical impact of the hoofs on the soil. After that heavy impact, you move them onto a next paddock, and they don't come back to a grazed paddock until it is fully recovered. So there should be absolutely no sign of grazing having happened there. If you inspect individual plants, you should not be able to find torn off leaves, a clear sign of having been grazed. So all the above ground material has to be so much recovered that it is all new. Some of it would be good if it's actually already dying off, the lower leaves, so turning yellow. At that time there should be no visible manure anymore either. It's all worked into the soil by the soil organisms. Then the grazing animals can return and have completely fresh growth without any sign of bacteria, viruses, what's the word, parasites, from their own manure. So the disease load is a lot lower. So that's what we've been doing here on this piece of land. Almost 2 hectares, surrounded by a perimeter fence with a shelter in the middle, which is wherever the sheep are, they can reach it through the fencing system, and they actually learn how it works very quickly. I'll try and show a map of what the fencing system looks like, and I'm working on a video that explains it in detail. But for now it's enough to know that this is the setup. Almost 2 hectares of pasture divided into 33 paddocks through which they can cycle. And I have another almost 2 hectares on which they can graze. And they have been on almost all of that land last grazing season. And so this now here, this paddock that they're on now, they haven't been on since last late summer. So absolutely no sign of old manure anymore. But obviously the plant material is not brilliant. In a good part of the growing season, sitting on my knees now, pointing the camera at the sheep, you should hardly be able to see them when you just put them in that paddock because the grass is that high. Now it's a poor shadow of that, and much of it has died over winter. Before winter started, all of this was green, and there was a lot more of it. But even now, I'll pick a little bit, and hopefully you'll see that there is some green material in there. I would say, actually, based on a few more of these samples that I've taken over the last few days, this is a fairly poor one. In some cases there's more than half of the leaves will be green. And I think I saw a particular good spot when I set up the fence right here. Yeah, look, that will be a nice bite when they find it. For winter conditions anyway. So I said a little bit about snow. There should be about 1 meter of snow right now. Still, snow has been gone for almost a month, I think, by now. It's a very strange year in a by now fairly long row of years already of very unusual weather, of course. But it doesn't really matter for the amount of food that they could find in this paddock, because no, actually it does, because if there would be snow still here that would have started falling in November, would be kind of normal, and that is when it started this winter, last winter. If it stays on all the time, it preserves the grass underneath. Now we've had 2 warm periods already, one in February, and then we had some snow again, and then the snow disappeared, and it's been wet, fairly wet at times anyway. There's also been dry periods, but the grass will deteriorate from now, from all those mixing different circumstances. So actually, if the snow would still have been here, much of this brown grass would still have been green, so they would actually have found more to eat. Now I compare this to some of the grazing areas that I know nearby, with either sheep, cows or horses, and all of them, as far as I'm aware, hey Chewy, no grazing is going on whatsoever at the moment. It is all 100% hay feeding still. The growing season is starting very, very carefully already. If you really go down on your knees and look in detail, you'll see a few careful new sprouts coming up, new leaves coming up, but it's not much yet. So I'll show a picture here of a nearby place where they keep horses, and the horses have been on this paddock all winter long, and because it has been warm and wet, much of it has been trampled, and the vegetation there has suffered enormously, and there is actually very little left at the moment. So those animals are basically just standing around all the time. They get hay all in one place, the same place every time, and a big bale of hay is easily eaten, so they eat their fill very quickly and then have nothing left to do, and they just stand around looking lost and bored. It looks horrible. And compare that to these ladies. The grass they are on, the land they are on right now, they haven't been on since late summer. There is vegetation, there is no bare soil. They can actually look for food. It's a lot harder to find a mouthful than it is in summer, of course, but they can manage. This is an old Swedish breed, or a mix of old Swedish breeds. They are well adjusted to the circumstances here. They can find their food. So I have been feeding hay this winter, and part of it is because I am inexperienced. There has been a ram with these ladies in December, January, so I'm hoping that they are pregnant. I think Chewy there is starting to show some of the roundness that you would expect, but it's a bit early. It's actually quite early still. I don't expect any lambs, if there will be any, until late May or even early June. That is pretty late, but still kind of within the limits of what you might call the natural timing. instead of having the lambs in January, February, which is more normal for businesses which keep their sheep indoors in winter. These ladies have not been indoors other than in the little shelter in the middle of the grazing area, and I think they have been absolutely fine. Their wool is incredibly thick. Anyway, they have been active all winter, and the hay I've been feeding them is not because they really couldn't find food anymore. Yeah, that was the thread that I lost. Yep, I'll make the jump again to where I started trailing off, and that is with the lambs growing inside. I am not experienced with that at all yet. Well, a bit now, but I was maybe too careful and maybe too afraid that they would get too little food if they were dependent on what they could find underneath the snow. And so I fed them hay to keep them well filled. The gut fill has always been good throughout the winter, which I check daily. But, well, in part it was that is part of the reason why I started feeding hay. Another part was that the 40-50 centimeters of snow that we had early on, I think it was November, might have been early December. It started out as 40-50 centimeters of fluffy snow through which they could very easily dig and find food. There was no problem at all. And then there was a slightly warm period, well, it was above freezing, and the 40-50 centimeters of fluffy snow turned into 10 centimeters of very dense, heavy snow with an icy crust on top, which made it a lot harder for them to dig through. So that, combined with their lamb story, also made me feed hay. And at some point, for maybe about 2 months, in 2 periods, they've probably been on almost 100% hay, which I think was unnecessary. Also, because I fed them hay in the morning and just before sundown, I think I might have made it too easy for them. So by the time they woke up and wanted to eat, I came with the hay. And by the time they got hungry again, it was almost getting dark, and I came with hay again. So there was very little incentive for them to find any grass underneath the snow. That is definitely something I'm taking into consideration for next year, and I think I might push them a bit more if the lambing goes okay this year. But hopefully the snow conditions, the weather conditions will just be a lot more favorable next year as well. One other thing that contributed to hay feeding was that the fencing system failed a bit. Or actually, oh, this could be another long story. Again, because of the snow, at some point they were walking on top of the snow when it was thick and dense with the icy crust on top. So they didn't touch the ground anymore. That makes the electric fence system that you usually have with only positive wires and then a negative connection required, so them standing on soil to close the circuit, and then they get a shock if they touch the fence. Now that hardly happened at all because they didn't touch the soil. Also, their wool is so thick that any leftover power of the fence in that situation just didn't have an effect on them at all. And that meant that they could quite easily jump through the wires of the fence. Here you see what I came up with to prevent them from jumping through, which they did for quite a few times. So this is the 4-wire set that is electrified, which works quite well now. but not well enough to keep them from jumping through if this net fence wouldn't be on the outside. If they jump through quickly enough, they won't get zapped at all. So I will really have to retrain them to electric wire fence this summer, especially once I've sheared them. So then they will be more vulnerable to shock. And hopefully next winter I will be able to keep them just with the wire fence, because that I can move whenever I wanted to. When I started needing the net fence as an extra deterrent, well, if you put the fence in with a metal spike and it starts freezing, you won't be able to get it back out. And even if you can't put it back in another spot. Your fence would be ruined in no time. So at some point I had them somewhere, and because of previous escapes and because it's outside the growing season, it was more than one paddock. It was a collection of paddocks next to each other, and because the net fence froze into place, I couldn't move them anymore. So I had to leave them in that set of paddocks for a much longer time than I would have wanted to. And I had to feed them hay because of that as well. So any grass that was still underneath the snow, they found most of the grass hiding underneath the snow in all that time, of course, and then I had to feed them hay. So the reasons for feeding hay this last winter, I hope to be able to avoid next winter. At least quite as much hay as I have been feeding them. But this is a beautiful sight, them grazing in early spring, while all their fellow grazers in the neighborhood that I know of only have hay to eat still. And of course, some of the brown, or probably all the brown material here, is less nutritious than good quality hay, but any of the green material that they find in between will be far more nutritious than the best hay they could get. Happy? I think so. Oops, what happened there? That's a short overview of one of the benefits less talked about holistic grazing.